My insulin pump said, critical low, treat immediately. But the exam proctor took it away and said, no devices during testing means no devices. The vibration against my hip was subtle at first, the kind I'd learned to recognize instantly after 6 years of living with type 1 diabetes. But when the alarm started beeping, loud enough that the girl 2 seats over looked up from her test booklet, I knew I was in trouble. I glanced down at my Dexcom continuous glucose monitor clipped to my waistband. The screen showed 58 mg/dL in bright red letters with a downward arrow. Critical low. Treat immediately. I reached for the glucose tablets in my pocket, the ones I'd specifically shown to the testing coordinator that morning, the ones she'd approved with a bored nod and a check on her clipboard. Before my fingers even touched the package, a hand slammed down on my desk. Mrs. Valerie Novak, head proctor for the SAT testing site at Riverside High School, stood over me with her arms crossed and her face twisted in suspicion. Electronic device, she said, pointing at my Dexcom. Hand it over right now, or your test is invalidated. I tried to explain, my words coming out slower than they should have, my brain already starting to fog from the low blood sugar. It's not a phone, it's my glucose monitor. I have type 1 diabetes. I showed it to the coordinator this morning. Mrs. Novak's expression didn't change. She'd been a proctor for 15 years, according to the introduction she'd given at the start of the test, and she'd seen every trick students tried to cheat. No devices during testing means no devices. I don't care what it is. Give it to me now, or I'm calling your test invalid and escorting you out. My hands were already starting to shake. I'd been diabetic since I was 12, diagnosed after a week of unexplained thirst and exhaustion that my parents initially blamed on volleyball practice and stress. The diagnosis came in the emergency room after I'd collapsed during gym class, my blood sugar over 600 mg/dL. Since then, my life had been a careful balance of insulin, carbohydrates, and constant monitoring. The Dexcom CGM I wore was literally life-saving technology. It monitored my blood glucose levels every 5 minutes and sent the data to a receiver on my hip and an app on my phone. When my levels dropped too low or spiked too high, it alerted me so I could treat the problem before it became a crisis. I'd worn it every day for the past 3 years. I slept with it. I showered with it. I played volleyball with it taped securely to my abdomen. And I'd brought extensive documentation to the SAT testing center that morning specifically because I knew medical devices were a gray area in standardized testing protocols. The morning had started normally enough. I'd woken up at 6, checked my blood sugar on my meter, which showed a solid 110 mg/dL, eaten my carefully calculated breakfast of oatmeal and a banana, and dosed my insulin accordingly. My mom had driven me to Riverside High, even though I had my license, because she was nervous about the test and wanted to make sure I got there safely. You have your glucose tablets? She'd asked for the 3rd time as we pulled into the parking lot. And your juice boxes? And your emergency glucagon kit? I'd shown her everything, packed neatly in a clear plastic bag per the SAT guidelines. Mom, I've got this. I've been managing my diabetes for 6 years. I can handle a 4-hour test. She'd hugged me anyway, held on a little too long, and made me promise to text her the moment the test was over. I'd arrived at the check-in table at 7:15 for the 8 o'clock start time. The testing coordinator, a tired-looking woman in her 30s named Miss Brennan, had reviewed my medical documentation, the letter from my endocrinologist explaining my need for a continuous glucose monitor and access to fast-acting carbohydrates during the test. She'd initialed the letter, checked my Dexcom and glucose supplies, and sent me to testing room 3B with a yellow sticker on my admission ticket indicating approved medical accommodation. Everything had been fine for the first 90 minutes. The critical reading section had gone well. I'd felt confident about my answers, my brain sharp and focused. My Dexcom had shown steady numbers in the 120s perfect range. But somewhere during the transition to the math section, something had gone wrong. Maybe I'd miscalculated my breakfast insulin. Maybe the stress of the test was affecting my metabolism. Maybe my insulin pump had delivered too much without me noticing. Whatever the cause, by question 15 of the math section, my glucose levels had started dropping. I'd felt the first symptoms around 9:45, a familiar tingling in my fingers, a slight tremor in my hands that made holding my pencil harder. I'd checked my Dexcom discreetly. 89 mg/dL with a downward arrow. Not critical yet, but heading in the wrong direction. I'd popped 2 glucose tablets into my mouth, chewed them quickly, and gone back to my test. That should have been enough to stabilize me. Except it wasn't. By 10 o'clock, my glucose had dropped to 72 mg/dL, still falling. I'd taken 2 more tablets. My hands were shaking noticeably now, and sweat was beading on my forehead despite the air conditioning. The girl next to me kept glancing over, probably wondering why I was trembling. At 10:15, the Dexcom alarm went off. 58 mg/dL, critical low. That's when Mrs. Novak had appeared at my desk, and my nightmare had begun. I sat there, staring up at her, trying to make my foggy brain form coherent arguments. Please, I said, and I hated how my voice shook. I have documentation, medical accommodation. I showed everything to Miss Brennan this morning. This isn't a phone. It's medical equipment. I need it. Mrs. Novak held out her hand. I don't know what you showed to whom, but I'm the head proctor for this room, and I make the final decisions about testing protocols. That device is beeping and has a screen. It could be used to receive information. It's a violation of testing security. Hand it over now, or leave the testing room and forfeit your scores. I looked around desperately. Miss Brennan, the coordinator who'd approved my accommodation, wasn't in the room. There were two other proctors, younger women walking the aisles, but they were both watching Mrs. Novak with expressions that suggested they weren't going to contradict her. The other students in the room, about 30 kids total, were all staring at me now. Some looked annoyed at the disruption. Others looked curious. No one looked like they were going to help. My blood sugar was 58 and falling. Without treatment in the next few minutes, I'd drop below 50, possibly below 40. At those levels, I'd lose the ability to treat myself. I'd become confused, possibly combative. I could have a seizure. I could lose consciousness. I could die. I tried one more time. Mrs. Novak, please listen to me. I have type 1 diabetes. My blood sugar is dangerously low right now. If I don't treat it immediately, I'm going to pass out. That device you want me to give you is telling me my glucose level. I need it to know when I'm safe. Please, just let me keep it until my levels stabilize and then I'll put it away. 5 minutes. That's all I need. Mrs. Novak's expression hardened. I've been doing this for 15 years and I've heard every excuse. If you had a real medical condition, it would have been properly documented through official channels. Since you don't have the proper paperwork visible on your desk, I'm assuming you don't have accommodation approval. Now, hand over the device, or I'm invalidating your test and calling security to escort you out. My mind was moving slower now, syrupy and thick. I knew I had the paperwork. I knew I'd shown it to Miss Brennan, but I couldn't remember where it was. Had she kept it? Had she given it back? I tried to remember, but my thoughts kept sliding away from me, like trying to hold water in my hands. The room was starting to feel distant, sounds becoming muffled, vision narrowing slightly at the edges. I recognized the symptoms. I was dropping fast. I made a decision that I knew was wrong but felt necessary in the moment. I reached for my glucose tablets instead of my Dexcom. If I could just get my sugar up, I could think clearly enough to argue my case. Mrs. Novak's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. What is that? More unauthorized items? She snatched the package of glucose tablets from my hand. Those are glucose tablets, I said, my voice coming out slurred. I need them. My blood sugar is too low. Please give them back. Mrs. Novak examined the package with suspicion. These look like candy. No food or drink allowed during the test except water. You know the rules. She pocketed the glucose tablets. Now, the electronic device. Last warning. I couldn't think anymore. Couldn't form arguments. The room was spinning slightly, and my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't have held a pencil if I tried. I fumbled with the clip holding my Dexcom to my waistband, my fingers clumsy and uncoordinated. It took 3 tries to get it unclipped. When I finally managed it, Mrs. Novak snatched it from my hand immediately. Thank you. You can have this back after the test concludes. Now get back to work. You've already lost valuable time. She walked away, my Dexcom in one hand, my glucose tablets in the other, leaving me sitting at my desk with a blood sugar that was probably below 50 by now and no way to treat it. I tried to raise my hand to call her back, but my arm felt impossibly heavy. I tried to stand up to follow her, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The girl next to me leaned over and whispered, "Are you okay? You look really pale." I tried to answer, but my tongue felt thick in my mouth. I managed to mumble something that might have been diabetic or might have been gibberish. I wasn't sure anymore. The room was getting darker around the edges, tunnel vision closing in. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, fast and irregular. My shirt was soaked with sweat. I slumped forward, my forehead hitting the desk with a thud that I barely felt. The last thing I remembered clearly was the girl next to me screaming, "Something's wrong! She's not okay! Someone help!" Then everything went fuzzy. I was aware of movement, of voices shouting, of hands touching me, but it all felt far away, like I was underwater. Someone was calling my name. Someone was shaking my shoulder. I tried to respond, but I couldn't make my mouth work. There was a bitter taste in my mouth suddenly. Someone had put something under my tongue. Glucose gel, my brain supplied dimly. Emergency treatment for severe hypoglycemia. But it was too late for sublingual absorption to work fast enough. I was too far gone. I felt myself being moved, lifted, carried. Cold air on my face, the wail of sirens, a sharp pain in my arm. IV line, my brain said. Dextrose. They're giving me IV dextrose. That was the right treatment. That might save me. Then nothing. I woke up in a hospital bed with my mom crying next to me and a doctor I didn't recognize checking my vitals. The fluorescent lights were too bright, making me squint. My mouth was dry and tasted terrible. There was an IV in my left arm and a blood pressure cuff on my right. The steady beep of a heart monitor provided rhythm to the scene. "She's awake," my mom said, her voice thick with tears. She grabbed my hand and held it so tightly it hurt. "Oh, thank God you're awake. You scared me half to death, sweetie. Don't ever do that again." The doctor, a South Asian man in his 50s with kind eyes and graying hair at his temples, leaned over me. "Alexa, I'm Dr. Patel. I'm an emergency medicine physician here at County General. You've been unconscious for about 40 minutes. You had a severe hypoglycemic episode. When the paramedics found you, your blood glucose was 28. That's critically, dangerously low. We've given you IV dextrose and you're stabilizing now, but we need to monitor you for several more hours to make sure you don't crash again." 28. I'd never been that low before. The lowest I'd ever recorded was 41, and that had been terrifying enough. At 28, it was a miracle I hadn't had a seizure or slipped into a coma. What happened? Dr. Patel asked gently. Your mom said you were taking a standardized test. Did you forget to bring glucose? Did you not feel the symptoms? I tried to sit up, but he put a hand on my shoulder. Easy. Stay lying down for now. You're still recovering. I told him everything, my voice hoarse and shaking. About the SAT, about my Dexcom alarming, about Mrs. Novak confiscating my medical device and my glucose tablets despite my explanations, about how I'd tried to treat the low but wasn't allowed, about how I'd been trapped at my desk as my blood sugar plummeted. Dr. Patel's expression changed as I talked, shifting from concerned to angry. By the time I finished, his jaw was tight and his eyes were hard. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, he said, his voice carefully controlled. You had proper medical accommodation documentation. You informed the proctor that you had a medical emergency in progress. You told her you needed your glucose monitor and your fast-acting glucose to prevent a life-threatening situation. And she confiscated your medical equipment and your treatment anyway? I nodded. My mom made a strangled sound that was half sob, half rage. Dr. Patel turned to my mom. Mrs. Chen, I need you to listen to me very carefully. What happened to your daughter today was not just negligent. It was criminally negligent. Confiscating medical equipment from a diabetic patient experiencing hypoglycemia is like confiscating an inhaler from someone having an asthma attack or an EpiPen from someone in anaphylactic shock. It's not just wrong. It's potentially deadly. Your daughter could have died. At a blood glucose of 28, she was minutes away from seizures, coma, or death. If the paramedics had arrived even 5 minutes later, we might be having a very different conversation right now. My mom was crying harder now, but there was fury in her eyes too. What do we do? Can we sue? Can we press charges? That woman nearly killed my daughter because she was too stubborn to listen. Dr. Patel pulled out his phone. First, I'm documenting everything. This is a reportable medical incident. I'm required by law to file a report when a patient presents with injuries or medical emergencies that result from another person's actions or negligence. I'm going to be very thorough in my documentation. Second, I'm going to have you speak with our patient advocate. Her name is Karen Yates, and she specializes in cases involving medical discrimination and institutional negligence. Third, I strongly recommend you contact an attorney who handles disability rights cases. What happened here violated multiple laws, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, and possibly constitutes assault or reckless endangerment. He stepped out of the room to make calls, leaving me alone with my mom. She was still holding my hand, still crying, but now she was also furious. I'm going to destroy her, she said quietly. That proctor, whoever she is. I'm going to make sure she never works with children again. She could have killed you, Alexa. You could have died taking a stupid test because she was too arrogant to admit she was wrong. I squeezed her hand weakly. I tried to tell her, Mom. I tried to explain. She wouldn't listen. She said I was trying to cheat, that I didn't have proper documentation, that she'd been doing this for 15 years and knew all the tricks students used. She treated me like I was a liar. My mom's face was red with anger. You had documentation. We spent 2 weeks getting that letter from Dr. Hammond. We followed every single rule the college board published about medical accommodations. We did everything right and she still nearly killed you. She pulled out her phone. I'm calling your father. He needs to know what happened. Then I'm calling a lawyer. And then I'm calling the school district and the college board and anyone else who'll listen. Over the next hour, while I lay in the hospital bed slowly recovering as the dextrose brought my blood sugar back to safe levels, my mom made call after call. She spoke to my dad, who left work immediately and arrived at the hospital 20 minutes later, his face pale and his hands shaking when he saw me. She spoke to our family lawyer, who referred her to a specialist in disability rights and medical negligence. She spoke to the testing coordinator, Miss Brennan, who sounded horrified when she learned what had happened and confirmed that yes, my accommodation had been properly approved and documented. She spoke to someone at the college board who promised an immediate investigation. Each conversation made her angrier, more determined. Dr. Patel returned with Karen Yates, the patient advocate. She was a black woman in her early 40s with box braids and the calm, competent demeanor of someone who'd seen every kind of medical crisis and administrative disaster. She pulled up a chair next to my bed and took out a tablet. Alexa, I'm so sorry this happened to you. Dr. Patel filled me in on the basics, but I need to get your full account in your own words. I'm going to record this conversation if that's okay with you. This recording will be part of your medical record and can be used as evidence if you decide to pursue legal action. I told the story again, more slowly this time, including every detail I could remember. Karen asked clarifying questions. What time had the alarm gone off? Exactly what had Mrs. Novak said? Had any other proctors witnessed the interaction? Had any other students? What was my blood glucose reading when the alarm sounded? What symptoms had I experienced? How long had I been without treatment? When I finished, Karen was quiet for a moment, making notes on her tablet. Then she looked up at me with an expression that was both sympathetic and furious. Alexa, what happened to you is a textbook case of disability discrimination. The proctor violated your rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act by refusing to honor your approved medical accommodation. She also committed what could potentially be charged as assault or reckless endangerment by confiscating medical equipment from someone in medical distress. Dr. Patel's medical report will document that you suffered a life-threatening medical emergency as a direct result of her actions. You have a very strong case for both a civil lawsuit and potentially criminal charges. She turned to my parents. I'm going to connect you with an attorney I've worked with before. His name is Thomas Grayson. He's a partner at Grayson & Associates, and he specializes in disability rights, medical negligence, and institutional liability. He's won several high-profile cases against schools and testing organizations. If anyone can hold these people accountable, it's him. My dad, who'd been quiet until now, finally spoke. His voice was low and controlled, but I could hear the rage underneath. Will that proctor face consequences? Real consequences? Not just a slap on the wrist or a transfer to another school? Karen met his eyes. If you pursue this properly, yes. At minimum, she should lose her job. At maximum, she could face criminal charges for reckless endangerment. The school district could face massive liability for failure to train staff on medical accommodations. The testing organization could face federal investigation for ADA violations. This isn't just about one bad proctor. This is about systemic failures that put your daughter's life at risk. My mom pulled out her phone again. Give me this lawyer's number. I want to call him right now. Karen sent the contact information. While my mom stepped into the hallway to call Thomas Grayson, Karen stayed with me, explaining what would happen next. The hospital would keep me for observation for at least 6 more hours. They'd monitor my blood glucose levels closely to make sure the rebound from the IV dextrose didn't cause dangerous swings in either direction. They'd run some additional tests to check for any organ damage from the severe hypoglycemia. Dr. Patel would file his incident report with the state medical board and with local law enforcement. I'd be examined by a neurologist to assess if the episode had caused any brain damage, which could occur when glucose levels drop that low for extended periods. Brain damage? I repeated, my voice small. I'd known severe hypoglycemia was dangerous, but I'd never thought about permanent consequences. Karen's expression softened. It's precautionary. Most likely, you'll be fine. You're young. You were treated relatively quickly once the paramedics arrived, and you're already recovering well. But severe hypoglycemia can, in rare cases, cause neurological damage. We want to make sure you're completely okay. She paused. Alexa, I want you to understand something. You didn't do anything wrong. This wasn't your fault. You followed the rules. You got proper medical documentation. You tried to advocate for yourself when the emergency started. An adult in a position of authority made a catastrophically bad decision, and you suffered the consequences. Don't let anyone make you feel like you should have done something differently. I nodded, but I kept thinking about all the moments I could have changed. I could have been more forceful with Mrs. Novak. I could have just walked out of the testing room instead of trying to convince her. I could have caused a bigger scene, made other students intervene. Maybe if I'd been louder, more insistent, she would have listened. Karen seemed to read my mind. Stop that. I can see you blaming yourself. Don't. You were a 17-year-old kid in medical distress trying to reason with an adult who had power over you. She was the one with the responsibility to listen and respond appropriately. She failed, not you. My mom came back into the room, her phone still in her hand. I talked to Thomas Grayson. He wants to meet with us tomorrow. He said this case has everything he looks for in terms of clear liability, documented harm, and institutional negligence. He's already drafting a demand letter to send to the school district and the college board. She looked at me, her eyes still red from crying. How are you feeling, sweetie? Any better? I checked my Dexcom, which one of the paramedics had apparently retrieved from Mrs. Novak and returned to me. My blood sugar was 145 mg/dl and holding steady. I'm okay. Tired, shaky, but okay. My dad sat down on the other side of the bed. We're not going to let this go, Alexa. That woman nearly killed you because she was too arrogant to listen when a kid told her there was a medical emergency. She's going to pay for that. They're all going to pay for that. The neurologist arrived around 3 in the afternoon. Dr. Janet Kwan was a specialist in traumatic brain injury and metabolic disorders affecting the brain. She was in her late 40s, Chinese-American, with wire-rimmed glasses and a brisk, efficient manner. She ran me through a series of cognitive tests, checking my memory, my processing speed, my motor coordination, my visual tracking. After 40 minutes of testing, she seemed satisfied. Your cognitive function appears normal, she said, making notes on her tablet. No signs of acute neurological damage from the hypoglycemic episode. However, I want to see you for follow-up in 2 weeks. Sometimes subtle deficits can appear days later as the brain finishes recovering. We'll do more comprehensive neuropsychological testing then to make sure everything is functioning properly. She turned to my parents. Your daughter was very lucky. At a blood glucose of 28, maintained for the length of time it took paramedics to arrive and begin treatment, there was significant risk of permanent brain injury. The fact that she's showing no immediate deficits is fortunate, but we need to remain vigilant. Watch for any changes in her behavior, her sleep patterns, her academic performance. Headaches, confusion, memory problems, difficulty concentrating. Any of these could be delayed symptoms of hypoglycemic brain injury. My mom's hand tightened on mine again. The doctor's words were reassuring and terrifying at the same time. I was okay now, but I might not be okay later. There might be damage I couldn't see yet, problems that would emerge in the coming days or weeks, all because Mrs. Novak had been too stubborn to listen. I was discharged from the hospital at 6 that evening with strict instructions to monitor my blood glucose every hour for the next 24 hours, to avoid strenuous activity, and to return immediately if I experienced any symptoms of recurring hypoglycemia or neurological changes. My parents drove me home in silence, both of them checking on me constantly, asking if I was okay, if I felt dizzy, if I needed anything. When we got home, my younger brother, who was 14 and usually obnoxious, gave me a hug that lasted longer than any hug he'd given me since we were little kids. "Mom called and told me what happened," he said quietly. "I'm glad you're okay. That proctor sounds like a complete psycho." My mom made me my favorite dinner, carefully calculated for carbs and protein to keep my blood sugar stable. I ate mechanically, not really tasting anything. My phone kept buzzing with texts from friends who'd been at the testing center, who'd seen me collapse, who'd heard rumors about what happened. I didn't have the energy to respond to most of them. Around 8, my best friend Jenna called. I answered because ignoring her felt worse than talking. "Alexa, oh my God, are you okay? Maya was in your testing room and she said you passed out and they called an ambulance and there were like 5 cop cars and everyone was freaking out. What happened?" I gave her the abbreviated version. Jenna's response was immediate and furious. "That's insane. That's actually insane. She took your medical equipment? During a medical emergency? How is that not a crime?" "It might be," I said quietly. "My parents are talking to lawyers. There might be criminal charges." Jenna was silent for a moment. "Good. She deserves it. You could have died, Alexa. You could have actually died because she was too stupid to understand what a glucose monitor is." We talked for another 20 minutes, Jenna's outrage somehow comforting. She promised to spread the word at school about what really happened, to make sure people knew I hadn't just randomly passed out, that there was an adult to blame. When we hung up, I felt marginally better. At least people would know the truth. The meeting with Thomas Grayson happened at his law office on a Sunday morning, less than 24 hours after my hospitalization. His office was in a sleek high-rise downtown, all glass and modern furniture. Thomas himself was in his mid-50s, tall and imposing with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of calm confidence that came from winning difficult cases. He shook hands with my parents and smiled kindly at me. "Alexa, I'm very glad to see you looking healthy. Karen Yates sent me your medical records from yesterday, and I have to say, you're very fortunate to have recovered so completely." He led us into a conference room where another lawyer was waiting, a younger woman with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. "This is my associate, Rebecca Flores. She specializes in education law and ADA compliance. She'll be working with me on your case." We sat down and Thomas opened a folder thick with documents. "Let me start by saying you have an extraordinarily strong case. The facts are clear, the liability is obvious, and the damages are well documented. The proctor violated federal disability law. The school district failed in its duty to properly train staff on medical accommodations. The testing organization failed to ensure that approved accommodations were honored. All 3 parties share liability for what happened to you." He pulled out the first document. "This is your medical accommodation approval from the College Board, submitted 6 weeks before the test date. It clearly states that you are approved to use a continuous glucose monitor and to have access to fast-acting glucose during the test. This approval was sent to the testing site coordinator, Miss Brennan, who confirmed she received it and reviewed it with you on test day. So there's no question that your accommodation was official and approved." Rebecca took over. "We've already obtained the testing center's security footage from that day. It clearly shows Mrs. Novak approaching your desk, taking your Dexcom, and confiscating your glucose tablets. It also shows you attempting to communicate with her, though there's no audio. What's particularly damaging for her is what happens after. The footage shows you visibly deteriorating, slumping over your desk, and her ignoring you for approximately 7 minutes before another proctor notices and calls for help. 7 minutes during which you were in obvious medical distress, and she did nothing. 7 minutes. I'd lost consciousness during those 7 minutes. I hadn't known she'd watched me suffer for that long." My mom made an angry sound. "She watched my daughter collapse and didn't help?" Rebecca's expression was grim. "According to the timestamps on the footage, yes. Mrs. Novak walked past your desk twice during those 7 minutes. She had to have seen you were in distress. She chose not to intervene." Thomas pulled out another document. "This is Dr. Patel's incident report. He's classified your hypoglycemic episode as a life-threatening emergency directly caused by deprivation of medical equipment and treatment. He stated in his professional medical opinion that without the confiscation of your glucose monitoring device and glucose tablets, this emergency would not have occurred. He's also filed a report with local law enforcement recommending investigation for reckless endangerment." My dad leaned forward. "What's the next step? How do we make sure she's held accountable?" Thomas smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. "We file a comprehensive lawsuit against all responsible parties. Mrs. Novak personally, for her individual actions. The school district, for failing to properly train and supervise staff. The testing organization, for failure to ensure approved accommodations were honored. We seek damages for medical expenses, pain and suffering, emotional distress, and punitive damages to send a message that this behavior won't be tolerated." We also file a formal complaint with the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Education, which handles ADA violations. They can open a federal investigation that could result in loss of federal funding for the school district if they're found to have systemic issues with disability accommodation. Rebecca added, "We'll also be reaching out to media. This is the kind of story that gets attention. Teen nearly dies during SAT because proctor confiscated her medical equipment. It's outrageous enough that news outlets will want to cover it, which puts additional pressure on all parties to settle quickly and change their policies." My mom looked at me. "Alexa, this is going to be public. People will know your name, know your medical condition. Are you okay with that?" I thought about it. Part of me wanted to hide, to pretend this never happened, to just move on. But another part of me was furious. Mrs. Novak had nearly killed me, and if I stayed silent, she might do it to someone else. Some other diabetic kid, some other student with a medical condition, someone who might not be as lucky as I'd been. "I want to do it," I said. "I want people to know what happened. If it stops this from happening to someone else, it's worth it." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Good. That's the right attitude. Now before we proceed, I need to warn you that this won't be easy. The defendants will try to discredit you. They'll argue that you didn't properly communicate the emergency, that you should have left the testing room, that you bear some responsibility for what happened. They'll try to paint Mrs. Novak as a dedicated educator who made a judgment call in a difficult situation. We need to be prepared for that." He pulled out more documents, photos that made my stomach turn. Pictures of me unconscious on the classroom floor, paramedics working on me, an IV in my arm. These were taken by students at the scene. They've already been circulating on social media. We're going to use them as evidence of the severity of the emergency and the visible distress you were in. They're hard to look at, but they're powerful evidence. Over the next hour, Thomas and Rebecca outlined their strategy. They'd file the lawsuit within the week. They'd simultaneously file complaints with the Office for Civil Rights, the State Education Board, and the Professional Standards Board that licensed test proctors. They'd reach out to sympathetic media outlets and offer interviews. They'd build public pressure while simultaneously building their legal case. The goal was to force a settlement that included not just monetary compensation, but also systemic changes. Mandatory training for all test proctors on medical accommodations. Clear protocols for handling medical emergencies during testing. Third-party oversight of accommodation implementation. And Mrs. Novak's termination. "I want to be clear about something," Thomas said, looking directly at me. "The money isn't the point here. Yes, you deserve compensation for what you went through, but the real goal is making sure this never happens again. We want to change policies. We want to make schools and testing organizations take medical accommodations seriously. Your case can do that if we handle it right." I nodded. "I understand. I don't care about the money. I just don't want her to hurt anyone else." Thomas smiled. "Then we're on the same page. Let's make this count." The lawsuit was filed on Monday morning, exactly 48 hours after my hospitalization. By Monday afternoon, it was news. Local TV stations picked it up first, running stories about teen dies during SAT after proctor confiscates medical equipment. The headline wasn't quite accurate since I hadn't died, but it captured attention. My parents had agreed to let me do one televised interview, and we chose a sympathetic local reporter who'd covered diabetes awareness issues before. The interview aired Monday evening. I sat on my living room couch, my mom next to me, and told the story calmly and clearly. The reporter, Linda Chen, was gentle in her questions but didn't shy away from the hard parts. "Alexa, when Mrs. Novak took your glucose monitor, what went through your mind?" I met the camera directly. I was confused at first, and then I was scared. I knew my blood sugar was dropping fast. I knew I needed treatment. I tried to explain that I had a medical emergency happening right then, but she didn't believe me. She thought I was lying to get access to an electronic device during the test. She told me she'd been a proctor for 15 years and knew all the tricks students used to cheat. She wouldn't listen. Linda leaned forward. "You had proper documentation of your medical accommodation, correct?" I nodded. "Yes. We submitted it 6 weeks in advance, exactly as required. The testing coordinator reviewed it that morning and approved everything. I did everything right, but Mrs. Novak either didn't know about the accommodation or didn't care." Linda asked about the collapse, about the hospital, about my recovery. I answered truthfully, including the part about the neurologist checking for brain damage, about the blood glucose level of 28 that should have killed me. By the time the interview ended, I was crying, and so was my mom. But I'd said what needed to be said. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. The interview clip went viral on social media, racking up millions of views within 24 hours. Comments poured in from diabetics sharing similar stories of having their medical equipment confiscated or their conditions dismissed by authority figures. Parents of diabetic children expressed horror and rage. Educators weighed in, some defending Mrs. Novak's adherence to rules, but most condemning her failure to recognize a medical emergency. The hashtag #ListenToPatients started trending. Diabetes advocacy organizations picked up the story. The American Diabetes Association released a statement condemning the incident and calling for better training for school and testing staff. The Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation offered to help fund my legal case. National news outlets started calling, wanting interviews. Thomas handled media strategically, accepting some interview requests and declining others, always keeping the focus on systemic change rather than just my individual story. On Wednesday, 3 days after the incident, the school district released a statement. It was careful, lawyered, and mostly useless. We take all allegations of improper conduct seriously and are conducting a thorough investigation. We cannot comment on ongoing legal matters, but the safety and well-being of all students is our top priority. Translation: they were covering their asses and hoping the story would go away. It didn't. On Thursday, the College Board released their own statement. We are deeply concerned by the reported incident and are reviewing our protocols for medical accommodations. All approved accommodations should be honored without exception, and we are working with our testing partners to ensure proper training and oversight. It was slightly better than the school district's response, but still felt inadequate. That same day, Thomas received a call from the school district's attorney. They wanted to talk settlement. Thomas reported this to us in a conference call Thursday evening. They're scared. The publicity is killing them. They want to settle quickly and quietly. They're offering $150,000 and an agreement not to pursue the lawsuit if you'll sign a non-disclosure agreement. My dad's response was immediate. Absolutely not. The NDA is exactly what we don't want. The whole point is to make this public so it doesn't happen again. Thomas sounded pleased. That's what I told them. I counteroffered. $500,000, no NDA, a written apology from Mrs. Novak and the school district, termination of Mrs. Novak's employment, and implementation of a comprehensive medical accommodation training program for all staff. They're considering it, Rebecca added. We're also hearing from the State Education Board. They've opened an investigation into the district's compliance with ADA requirements. If they find systematic violations, the district could face federal sanctions. That's additional pressure. Over the next week, I tried to return to normal life. I went back to school on Monday, a full week after the incident. Walking through the hallways felt surreal. Everyone knew what had happened. Some students stopped me to say they were glad I was okay. Others stared or whispered. A few teachers pulled me aside to apologize on behalf of educators everywhere. My volleyball coach hugged me and cried. But there was also backlash. A group of students whose SAT scores had been invalidated because of the disruption my medical emergency caused blamed me for ruining their test. Someone spray-painted "attention seeker" on my locker. Anonymous accounts on social media claimed I was faking my diabetes for sympathy or trying to get out of taking the test fairly. The principal, Dr. Ramsey, a stern woman in her 60s who'd been running the school for 15 years, called me into her office on my second day back. Alexa, she said, her tone carefully neutral. I want you to know that we support you completely, and we're taking this matter very seriously. However, I need to ask you to keep a low profile for the next few weeks. The media attention is creating a disruption for other students, and we need to maintain a proper learning environment. I stared at her. You want me to keep a low profile? I almost died because one of your staff members took my medical equipment during a medical emergency, and you want me to be quiet about it? Dr. Ramsey's expression hardened slightly. I'm not asking you to be quiet. I'm asking you to be mindful of how your media presence is affecting the school community. Some students are feeling uncomfortable with the attention. I stood up. Maybe they should feel uncomfortable. Maybe everyone should be uncomfortable with the fact that a teacher at this school nearly killed a student. I'm not going to apologize for talking about what happened to me. I walked out of her office before she could respond. That conversation made it into the news cycle too, because I told Thomas about it and he told the media. School asks victim to stay quiet was the headline. The backlash against the school intensified. Parents started pulling kids out of the school's standardized testing programs. The school board received hundreds of angry emails. 2 board members called for Dr. Ramsey's resignation. On the legal front, things were progressing quickly. The school district's insurance company was pushing hard for settlement, not wanting to risk a trial that could result in a much larger verdict. Mrs. Novak had hired her own attorney, a defense lawyer named Richard Sloan, who specialized in defending educators accused of misconduct. He released a statement claiming Mrs. Novak had followed proper procedures and had no way of knowing I was experiencing a real medical emergency. My client is a dedicated educator with 15 years of unblemished service. She was enforcing testing security protocols in good faith. The tragic outcome was unforeseeable, and not the result of any wrongdoing on her part. Thomas tore that argument apart in a press conference. Mrs. Novak was explicitly told by a student that she was experiencing a medical emergency. The student showed her a medical device displaying critical low blood glucose. The student asked for her glucose tablets to treat the emergency. Mrs. Novak confiscated the medical device, confiscated the treatment, and then watched as the student visibly deteriorated over 7 minutes without calling for medical assistance. This wasn't an unforeseeable accident. This was deliberate indifference to a known medical emergency, and it nearly killed a child. The Office for Civil Rights Investigation moved faster than expected. In mid-November, about 6 weeks after the incident, they released their preliminary findings. The school district had violated the Americans with Disabilities Act in multiple ways. They had failed to properly train staff on medical accommodations. They had no written protocols for handling medical emergencies during standardized testing. They had no system for ensuring that approved accommodations were communicated to all relevant staff. Mrs. Novak had never received any training on diabetes, continuous glucose monitors, or the legal requirements of medical accommodations. The district was given 90 days to implement corrective measures or face loss of federal funding. The pressure became overwhelming for the school district. In early December, they agreed to Thomas's settlement terms. $500,000 paid to me and my family. A formal written apology from the district acknowledging their failures. Termination of Mrs. Novak's employment, effective immediately, with a notation in her personnel file that would prevent her from being hired as an educator or proctor anywhere else. Implementation of a comprehensive medical accommodation training program for all district staff, creation of clear written protocols for handling medical emergencies, and no non-disclosure agreement, meaning I was free to continue speaking publicly about what happened. Mrs. Novak fought her termination through her union, but the union ultimately declined to support her once the full security footage became public. Watching yourself ignore a student in medical distress for 7 minutes while she collapses is apparently too much even for union protection. The college board also settled, though for a smaller amount, $75,000, plus an agreement to overhaul their accommodation procedures nationwide. They implemented a new system where approved accommodations are flagged in multiple systems and communicated to testing site staff through multiple channels. They created a hotline for students to report accommodation violations in real time, and they funded a nationwide training program for test proctors on recognizing and responding to medical emergencies. The criminal investigation took longer. The district attorney's office reviewed Dr. Patel's report and the security footage. In January, about 4 months after the incident, they announced they would not be filing criminal charges against Mrs. Novak. While her actions were negligent and resulted in serious harm, we don't believe we can prove criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt. This is better addressed through the civil system and administrative consequences. I was disappointed by that decision, but Thomas had warned me it was likely. Criminal prosecution in cases like this is difficult because you have to prove intent or recklessness beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutors are risk-averse. They don't like taking on cases they might lose. The civil settlement and her termination are meaningful consequences, even if they're not criminal. He was right, but it still felt incomplete. Mrs. Novak lost her job and her reputation, but she didn't face any criminal penalty for nearly killing me. She released one final statement through her lawyer, claiming she'd been made a scapegoat for systemic problems, that she'd been following the procedures she'd been trained to follow, that she'd never intended to harm anyone. She never actually apologized, not directly to me, not publicly, just vague regrets about the unfortunate outcome. I did my follow-up neuropsychological testing in December. Dr. Kwan put me through 6 hours of comprehensive cognitive testing over 2 sessions. When the results came back, she smiled. No deficits. Your cognitive function is completely normal across all domains. No evidence of any lasting neurological damage from the hypoglycemic episode. You were very, very lucky. I cried with relief. I'd been worried for months that there might be damage I couldn't see, problems that would emerge later. Knowing I was completely okay felt like a weight lifting. The settlement money arrived in January. My parents put most of it into a trust fund for my college education. We used some of it to upgrade my diabetes management technology, getting the latest insulin pump and continuous glucose monitor systems. And we donated $50,000 to the American Diabetes Association to fund advocacy and education programs. I retook the SAT in December at a different testing center with a different proctor who treated my medical accommodation with appropriate respect. I scored in the 95th percentile, good enough to get into my first choice college with a scholarship. I graduated high school in May with honors, gave a speech at graduation about advocacy and standing up for yourself even when authorities dismiss you. I'm in college now, studying pre-med with a focus on endocrinology. I want to become a diabetes specialist, helping other kids manage their condition and advocating for better medical accommodation in schools. I still have my Dexcom, still wear it every day, but now I also carry laminated copies of my accommodation documentation, a letter from my endocrinologist, and Thomas Grayson's business card, just in case. Mrs. Novak never worked in education again. Last I heard, she was working retail at a department store, still maintaining she'd done nothing wrong, still blaming everyone else for the consequences of her choices. The school district implemented their new training programs. They're now considered a model for how to handle medical accommodations properly. Other districts around the country have adopted their protocols. My story gets used in training materials for educators, for test proctors, for anyone who works with students with medical conditions. I've spoken at diabetes advocacy conferences, sharing my experience and encouraging other diabetics to advocate for themselves. The changes that came from my case have probably prevented similar incidents for thousands of students. But I still think about that day sometimes. Still remember the feeling of my blood sugar dropping, the panic when Mrs. Novak took my Dexcom, the frustration of trying to explain and not being heard. Still remember the darkness closing in as I lost consciousness at my desk. It left scars, even if they're not visible. I have anxiety around standardized testing now. I over-prepare for any situation where I might need to advocate for my medical needs. I sometimes dream about being trapped somewhere without my glucose, without my insulin, unable to treat myself. But I also have strength I didn't have before. I know now that being right isn't always enough. Sometimes you have to fight, even when fighting means going against authority figures who should know better. Sometimes you have to make noise, even when people tell you to keep quiet. Sometimes you have to refuse to let other people's comfort matter more than your own survival. My insulin pump said, critical low, treat immediately. The exam proctor took it away and said, no devices during testing means no devices. She nearly killed me with her stubbornness and her rules. But I survived, and I made sure no one else would have to go through what I did. That has to count for something. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.